vegetarian organization. Another thing that the vegetarian organization does that I think is really useful is they're actually trying to work with the Danish Health Organization to mandate, to actually have them put in writing that a vegan diet is healthy for all stages of life. That is something that we have here in the United States, but it is still, they're not there yet in Denmark. The next example I want to give is something that's not from an organization that's concerned chiefly with animals or the environment. It's an organization that's essentially was started by two famous Danish chefs. And the idea is that it wants to sort of increase people's depth of understanding of and connection with the preparation and consumption of plant-based food. And what the organization has done to that effect is they actually developed an app. And the app is a guide to how to forage for food in Denmark. So it's limited to the plants that are available in Denmark, but it gives not only a list of where these plants can be found, but also how to procure them, how to store them, to do it sustainably, and recipes. Now, obviously this is not a way for people to replace their staples of their diet. This is purely supplemental, and it's probably more than anything recreational. But what I really like about this is that it allows people to get a sort of knowledge base for the food that they're consuming, and to turn the consumption of plant-based foods into a recreational activity and a skill set that they can pass on to their children and to their friends. And it also allows them to interact with their surrounding environment. Finally, and I think this might be my favorite of these three examples, is that there is a animal rights-focused youth organization that's based in Copenhagen. And they actually have a mentor program for individuals who would like to learn how to be vegan. And I really like this because I think so often in our vegan outreach and our animal rights advocacy, we kind of sell people an ideology and then we sort of abandon them and leave them to figure out how to actually apply it to their own lives. And this actually creates a relationship between people who have more experience and people who maybe they understand the why, but they don't quite understand the how. And that's really not simple at all. And it's a very difficult thing for people who are not familiar with veganism. So what they actually do is people can submit their information online to the website, and then the staff will actually pair them up with someone who is more experienced and has been vegan for several years. And then they can contact this person and start to have sort of a social media relationship, or if they want, an actual real-life friendship where they're sort of coached and they're integrated into a network of people who have the sort of answers to questions and can tell them, you know, this is where you can buy this, and these are some of the debates that you might want to think about, this sort of thing. So now let's compare that with what we have traditionally witnessed. And there's a lot of what I would call traditional vegan outreach here in Denmark. Traditional vegan outreach is very focused on persuading or converting, quote unquote, individuals. And it's very focused on this idea of moral consistency and pointing out to people that their values towards animals do not actually line up with their consumer choices and their lifestyle decisions. And again, I'm not saying that this is an incorrect argument, and I'm not saying that it doesn't have value as a persuasion technique. But I think that we need to move beyond that, precisely because, as an anthropologist, I know all of our lives are full of contradiction all the time. And for most of us who are not really dedicated activists, which is to say for most of the population, moral inconsistency is not what we're chiefly concerned about. We're concerned about other things like whether our children are actually going to even eat. We're concerned about whether we're fitting in with our groups at work and in our spare time. And we have to find ways to deal with these very troubling realities about the fact that not everyone is as concerned with moral consistency as us. And we have to give them avenues and, as I say, an infrastructure to actually deal with this. And that kind of leads me to what I mean when I say, well, veganism is not that simple. I don't know how, if anybody here is vegan or how long you may have been vegan, but it's not a clear thing at all. And it really depends on the kind of circumstances you yourself are a part of and the kind of decisions you want to make for yourself about what constitutes vegan and what doesn't. And anyone who's been vegan for any length of time knows that There's just so many forums out there where there's debates about, is honey acceptable? Can we drink wine that was filtered through a fish bladder? And then ultimately you can start talking about vulcanized rubber, because our society is just so completely reliant on the exploitation of non-human animals. And I think it's important for us to allow different people to make certain different choices about their own limitations for what vegan is going to mean. And that doesn't mean we have to agree with them, but it does mean that we should recognize that different people have different circumstances and different pressures in their lives. And if we can give them guidance and then let them make their own rules, then we'll probably end up getting more people to be on our side most of the time. So this is where I think it's important for us to think about what food actually means. Because in traditional vegan advocacy, we tend to think of food as something that's about pleasure and what we often call tradition. We say, well, we've always done it this way, so we should have a right to do it this way. We say, well, that doesn't make sense. And I really agree, just because you have done something for a long time does not mean that it's morally okay. But again, we have to think about the actual values that these people have to their food. And the reality is that food is not just about this, it's about ways of integrating yourself into a group. Eating like other people eat, eating like your parents and your family eats. Preparing food for your family and your friends that they're going to be interested in consuming and that they won't call you weird for. These are all things that are tied into eating food that make it a lot more than just, is this affordable and is it tasty to me? So we have to be very aware of that, and especially aware of the fact that communities that are typically marginalized or are minorities tend to use food as an even more important sign of cultural and individual identity. So if you are an immigrant to a foreign country and you are marginalized and you feel very different from the dominant cultural practices around food, then you're going to latch onto your own food practices even more strongly because it gives you a sense for who you are. And someone coming to you with an abstract argument for animals is not necessarily going to be the most important thing for you. And those are very and this person has very valid concerns, and so we need to be able to work with them. So, in addition to what I've already said, there are a lot of different factors that govern our food choices, and we should, I'm repeating myself, but we should be aware of these, and we should also, to be aware of these things is also to be in solidarity with these other organizations, and so it's important for us to actually be doing work with human rights and with the kind of local problems that are facing marginalized communities, which not only gives us a chance to dialogue with them about food issues and the intersection of food issues with whatever it is they're concerned with, but I mean, this is, if we're going to talk about ethics, it's basic ethics too, right? To be concerned about everyone's issues. So, in conclusion, I want to talk about what a new way of looking at the animal liberation movement could look like if we try to separate animal liberation as a justice movement, which we absolutely should market it as, from individual consumption. My goal here is not to say that we should not advocate unapologetically for animal liberation and against speciesism. We absolutely should argue for that. But we also need to recognize that the abstract idea of this justice movement is a different thing than the real world hurdles that everyone faces when talking about food consumption and the different struggles they face. And in order to do that, what we should rather do is shift to actually looking at the ways that we can make it easier for people to consume less meat and fewer animal products, foster minor progress, form long-term relationships with people, rather than just trying to sell them on an idea of veganism and then setting them on the way. And becoming, as part of that relationship, becoming invested in their own struggles, whether that has to do with immigration or racism or police brutality or whatever these issues are. We have to form bonds and we have to negotiate. We have to find bridges where we can agree on things and maybe compromise. And we don't have to necessarily be happy with what they do, but we have to accept it. In feminism, there's a lot of discussion of the term feminisms in plural, and I think that there's room for us to incorporate something like that, of allowing different parts of the world to have different kinds of animal liberation and different kinds of veganism that are sensitive to the local culture and sensitive to the local concerns. And finally, I think it's important to remember that these things will change over time and that gradual change is okay. I don't think that people have a long memory about ethical consistency, but I do think that people who are reliant less on animal products for their everyday lives will be less defensive about the idea of shedding more of those animal products and adopting a worldview that does not put humans at the top of its hierarchies. That's all. Thank you.
So we have about 9 minutes left, so we're going to have some room for questions from the audience. If you have anything about the content of the presentations, you want to inquire more from them, can take any sort of questions you have. Yeah.
I have a question for Isabella. She does the photography, and I'm very into photography myself. You talked a lot about vision, and that animals have a very different ability to see the world. Should we be thinking about that as we take our photographs, or should we still be doing it like what we see?
Oh, wow. Well, I think that we are limited by our perception and our devices, right? I mean, we have a camera. Our cameras actually have an even more limited color space than our vision. We see way more colors than any device, pigment, or medium has ever been able to reproduce. So we're always limited by our tools and our perception. And we have to use that in order to, represent the world and our vision. So in a way, that's our limitation. And limitations are not a bad thing. They're actually really inspiring creatively. So, we have to work with our materials and our perceptions. But I do think it is really important to note that other species have an intelligence way beyond, and a perception way beyond even our imaginations. We cannot even imagine what they're able to perceive. And the more, as artists, as a photographer, you know that and you incorporate that into the way you present the world, the more it becomes part of the body of your work. So I think both things exist in the same process.
Do you have any other comments or questions? Yes, great. I'm going to hand you the mic so that make sure everybody can hear.
Yeah, I have a question for Drew. So just because I feel that in the past I've focused a lot on vegan advocacy and vegan options and choices for humans and kind of thinking about human lifestyles. And what I discovered is that I've kind of shifted my focus now to be more towards the interests of non-human animals. And I found that focusing a lot on the vegan lifestyle tends to kind of erase animals as a central part of this conversation as the ones who are oppressed. So I guess I would just be interested in what you would say about both centering animals, maintaining animals as a central figure in our advocacy.
Well, I think it depends on what it is we're trying to focus on. So, for example, when I teach, when I give a lecture on animal liberation, I don't really talk about veganism that much. Usually I only mention it to say that I'm not going to be talking about it, because I think that when we're doing advocacy work that's focused on persuading people to change their ideas and their values, the center of that needs to be the animals. However, I think that if we're going to go beyond the sense of making people understand anti-speciesism as a social justice issue, which it absolutely needs to be talked about as such, and we absolutely need to be doing that, there's a large contingent of the animal rights community that refers to the vegan movement and focuses very heavily on the way that we should respond to speciesism in our society and to trying to remove animal exploitation from society. And on that end, I think it's important to, rather than looking at people in a sort of liberal sense as consumers who are making free choices, to instead build a bedrock for people to make, so that people have access to consuming less, and not necessarily be going vegan, but just approaching the ways in which people have access to these things so that they can eat less meat, and even not necessarily for animal liberation reasons, but because eating less meat is good for a lot of different reasons.
I have a question for the two at the table, because there was a touching on of intersectionality on the one hand, and then also about exploiting the reproductive processes of cows as well as hens. And it just made me think of recently, in light of the whole Harvey Weinstein sexual abuse scandal and kind of Me Too hashtags. Some people may have seen that all of a sudden, quickly thereafter, as expected, there was a kind of use by animal rights activists to have pictures of them cows or of hens, hashtag Me Too. And I'm just curious what you have to say about using the language of sexual abuse, specifically that language, around non-human animals, and how we use it. Because the abuse obviously takes place, no one's denying that. But what happens in the use that kind of, it's like a co-opting of that hashtag of that event, and then also when we use the language of sexual abuse almost freely between those cases of human sexual abuse and then in non-human cases.
Yeah, I mean, I have thought about this a lot. I think that's a really good question. I think it's unfortunate to try to link those two oppressions simultaneously. Not that they don't have similarities, but it's kind of like the Black Lives Matters, All Lives Matters thing. Yeah, we all know that all lives matters, but when it's said directly after Black Lives Matter, it belittles and it takes away the importance of the realization for a lot of people that yes, Black Lives Matter. So to link the Me Too hashtag to animal oppression at the same time as the Me Too, oppression of female humans is an unfortunate linkage because it takes away from both oppressions. It's kind of instead of enhancing the understanding of both oppressions, it's using one to belittle the other. So I tend to stay away from those simultaneous linkages, not because there's no value to them or no truth to them, but because when one is addressed, for me it's important to allow that to express itself in its fullest sense at that moment.
And kind of just adding, I actually really like what you said. I think it also, the discussion needs to be on if the use of these kind of hashtags or projects or language is latching on and building a network of connection and solidarity, or a co-optation of a spotlight to focus on a different topic. Like I find that to also be the case, like when the debate over discussions around using the phrase Holocaust around abortions, and I think it's doing a similar thing. I don't think the use of that is to build a solidarity or a linkage with Jews and Roma people, but to actually co-opt this language and this moral imperative, not to build solidarity, but to focus attention to a different thing. And I don't know, and I don't have a good answer on how to clearly link in a way of solidarity on those topics. And I think maybe, it has to maybe do sometimes with the timing and the power. So the Me Too is coming out at a specific time. There's a danger in latching on and making the focus turn directly to non-humans. But at the same time, is there a way, and I don't have an answer, I wish I had an answer, to make it so that the expansion of the non-human discussion also expands the discussion into sexual assault. And so that to me is a really interesting, important question, and I wish I had it.
Yeah, I just had a brief comment about that. I've heard accounts of human survivors of sexual assault using and talking about their own experience and their story and how that has helped them to connect with non-human animals. I feel like that's been successful.
And that might be, and that's a different way too, because then it's linking, it's a moment of solidarity where you're linking your own experiences with theirs and highlighting this kind of deep interconnection. Versus, if you don't do it and you just focus entirely on the animal, you're missing that link maybe between your story and another story. I think that's a great way of maybe linking it together. Here's my story, and here's this story, and I share the solidarity with these chickens or with these cows as well.
All right, well, I think that's about time. I want to thank all of our panelists again for your lovely work. Round of applause. We'll move right into session 2. Oh, thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.